Good evening, and welcome to this journey through the Arklay Mountains, a place where secrets sleep beneath stone and timber, where the past whispers through empty corridors, and where one structure stands at the center of everything that would come to pass in Raccoon City. Tonight, we're going to walk together through the complete history of the Spencer Mansion, from its very first blueprints to the moment it vanished in fire and smoke against the mountain sky. This isn't a story of fear, but of memory, of events unfolding slowly across decades, of decisions made in boardrooms and laboratories, and of a single night when everything hidden came to light. So settle in, and let us begin at the very beginning. Decades before any outbreak, decades before any team arrived, back when the mansion was just an idea in the mind of one man. Part 1. The Vision of Oswell E. Spencer. In the 1960s, deep within the inner circles of pharmaceutical ambition, there lived a man named Oswell E. Spencer. He was not yet the figure he would become, not yet the shadow behind Umbrella Corporation, but he was already dreaming of empire, of legacy, of a future where science could reshape humanity itself. Spencer had studied with two other men, brilliant minds who shared his fascination with the hidden potential locked inside living cells, Edward Ashford and James Marcus. Together, they had discovered something extraordinary during an expedition to West Africa. A flowering plant that seemed to possess properties unlike anything documented in modern biology. They called it the progenitor virus. The name itself carries weight. Progenitor, the origin, the beginning of something vast. But to study such things required secrecy, required space away from oversight and regulation, required a place where experiments could unfold over years, over decades, without interruption. And so Spencer began to envision a mansion, not merely a home, but a monument to his ambition, a laboratory hidden in plain sight, a fortress of stone and science, nestled so deep in the mountains that the world would never know what happened inside. He chose the Arklay Mountains, a vast wilderness northwest of a growing industrial city called Raccoon City. The terrain was difficult, thickly forested, prone to storms that rolled in from the lakes and hung in the valleys for days. Perfect. The location offered isolation. The trees would swallow sound. The mountain roads would discourage casual travelers. And the bedrock beneath would allow for excavation, for levels built downward into darkness, for laboratories that existed below the earth itself. Spencer purchased the land through shell companies, quiet transactions that left no trail back to his name. And in the late 1960s, construction began. The workers who arrived found themselves building something unusual. From the outside, the mansion would appear grand but eccentric. A sprawling estate done in European architectural style. All sharp gables and tall windows. Heavy doors of carved wood. Stonework that seemed imported from another century entirely. But the workers noticed peculiarities. Certain rooms had no windows at all. Walls were reinforced far beyond what any residential structure required. And there were spaces in the blueprints marked only as storage or mechanical that seemed to require unusual ventilation systems, steel doors, and electronic locks decades before such technology became commonplace in homes. Some workers asked questions. Those workers were reassigned or paid generously to forget, or simply disappeared from the project roles without explanation. The construction continued, slowly, meticulously, as Spencer insisted on perfection in every detail. The main hall was designed to impress, to distract. A grand entrance with a double staircase curving upward on either side. Chandeliers that caught light and scattered it across marble floors. The kind of space that made visitors look upward in wonder rather than noticing the small locked doors at ground level. The dining room featured a long table, portraits on the walls, a fireplace large enough to stand inside, everything a wealthy eccentric might desire in a remote estate. But behind certain paintings, hidden doors, beneath certain floor tiles, pressure plates connected to mechanisms unknown. The mansion was a puzzle box, and Spencer held every solution. As construction moved into the early 1970s, the upper levels neared completion while excavation continued below. Crews dug into the mountain itself, carving out vast chambers that would become laboratories, storage facilities, test chambers, living quarters for researchers who would spend months underground. These lower levels were connected to the mansion through a series of passages and elevators, some obvious, others concealed behind false walls or accessible only through solving particular sequences of actions in the rooms above. Spencer wanted security through obscurity, through complexity that would baffle intruders and protect his secrets through sheer architectural confusion. The mansion took shape like a dream made solid, like ambition poured into stone and steel. And by the mid-1970s, it stood complete against the mountainside. Windows dark, chimneys cold, waiting. Spencer arranged for minimal staff, a few groundskeepers, maintenance personnel who lived in a small guardhouse on the property, people who were paid extremely well to ask no questions and to report any trespassers immediately. The mansion appeared to be a private estate, occasionally occupied, lights visible in windows some nights, smoke from chimneys during winter, but mostly silent, mostly still. A strange monument to wealth in the wilderness. And beneath it all, the laboratories waited in darkness, waited for the work to begin, waited for the virus to arrive. Waited for science to push past every boundary that ethics and law had established. Part 2. Umbrella's Foundation and Early Research. In 1968, while the mansion was still under construction, Spencer and his associates formalized their partnership. They created a pharmaceutical company that would serve as the public face of their research. A legitimate enterprise that could attract funding, recruit talent, and operate laboratories around the world. They called it Umbrella Corporation. The name suggested protection, safety, shelter from harm, a promise that would become bitterly ironic in the decades to come. The company's public mission focused on pharmaceutical development, vaccines, treatments for diseases that plagued developing nations. They published papers in respected journals, hired prominent researchers, and built a reputation as an innovative force in biotechnology. But the true research happened elsewhere. The progenitor virus became the foundation of everything. This ancient organism discovered in West African soil possessed an extraordinary ability. It could rewrite genetic code, force rapid mutations, and trigger changes in organisms that would take evolution millions of years to accomplish naturally. Edward Ashford saw potential for medicine, for curing genetic disorders, for extending human life. James Marcus saw potential for creating entirely new organisms, biological tools that could serve specific purposes. Spencer saw potential for power. The mansion in the Arklay Mountains became one of several hidden research facilities, but it held special significance. It was Spencer's personal domain, the place where the most radical experiments could proceed without oversight, even from his partners. Researchers began arriving in the late 1970s. Scientists recruited carefully. Those willing to work in isolation, those whose ambition outweighed their ethics, or those who simply didn't ask what happened in the sealed levels below. They were housed in quarters beneath the mansion, comfortable but windowless rooms, supplied with everything they might need, and strictly forbidden from leaving the facility without authorization. The research began with small organisms, insects, plants, observing how the progenitor virus affected different biological systems, documenting the mutations, the sudden changes in size, aggression, resilience. The results were remarkable and horrifying in equal measure. A simple plant exposed to the virus might grow to 3 times its normal size within days, developing thick, woody stems and carnivorous traits never seen in its species. Some specimens had to be incinerated when they began moving, roots pulling themselves across laboratory floors toward heat sources. Insects became something worse. Wasps grew to the size of human hands, developed enhanced venom and heightened territorial instincts. Spiders constructed webs with tensile strength approaching steel cable, and all of them displayed unusual intelligence, problem-solving abilities that shouldn't exist in such simple nervous systems. The researchers documented everything, filled journals with observations, photographed specimens, and reported their findings through encrypted channels to Umbrella's central administration. But there were accidents. Containment breaches happened even in these early years. A wasp escaped its enclosure and had to be tracked through the mansion's ductwork for 3 days before finally being destroyed. A researcher was bitten by a spider specimen and developed necrotic tissue damage that required amputation of 2 fingers. These incidents were handled quietly, documentation was sealed, and research continued. As the 1980s began, the experiments expanded to larger animals. Dogs became early test subjects, chosen for their availability and for the ease of observation. Canines exposed to virus strains showed rapid physical deterioration, skin lesions, patches of exposed muscle and bone, but simultaneously demonstrated increased aggression and seeming immunity to pain. These creatures, designated Cerberus in internal documents, became a template for biological weapons development. Animals that required minimal care responded to basic commands and could be deployed in combat or security situations. The mansion's underground kennels echoed with howling that never quite sounded like normal dogs anymore. James Marcus, working at Umbrella's training facility, made his own breakthrough during this period. He developed what became known as the T-virus, a modified strain of progenitor that showed even more dramatic effects on living tissue. Samples of the T-virus arrived at the Spencer mansion in sealed containers. The researchers began new experiments immediately. This virus worked differently, faster, more violently. It attacked the host's existing tissue while simultaneously forcing rapid cellular regeneration. The result was creatures that died and continued moving, organisms whose bodies functioned even as they decayed. The implications were staggering. An army that felt no pain, soldiers who continued fighting even with catastrophic injuries, biological weapons that required no food, no sleep, no morale maintenance. But control remained elusive. The T-virus affected cognitive function in unpredictable ways. Test subjects became aggressive, unpredictable, driven by base instincts toward violence and feeding behavior. They could not follow complex commands, could not distinguish between targets. The research continued anyway, because failures in one area meant breakthroughs in another, and because Spencer believed that perfection was simply a matter of time and iteration. The mansion above remained largely unchanged through these years, a facade of normalcy maintained for any outsiders who might stumble upon the property. The few staff members who worked in the upper levels knew better than to ask about the sounds that sometimes drifted up from below. The strange mechanical hums, the occasional screaming that might have been animal or human or something in between. They maintained the grounds, kept the mansion presentable, and collected their generous paychecks without comment. In the laboratories below, specimen tanks lined the walls, glass cylinders filled with preservative fluid and the floating forms of failed experiments, creatures that had mutated beyond viability, organisms that taught the researchers what not to do next time. Cabinets held thousands of vials, each labeled with codes that described virus strains, concentration levels, exposure methods, an archive of biological warfare research that spanned years of work. And in the deepest level, the place researchers called the Pit, construction began on a special chamber. This would house Umbrella's most ambitious project yet, the Tyrant. Part 3. The Tyrant Project and Growing Instability. By the late 1980s, Umbrella had achieved what many considered impossible. The T-virus had been refined into something approaching stability, a strain that could reliably transform human subjects into aggressive, resilient creatures that could be directed with pheromones and basic conditioning. These zombies, though the term was never used in official documentation, represented a crude but effective biological weapon. But Spencer wanted more. He envisioned something that combined the virus's physical enhancements with retained intelligence, a humanoid weapon that could think, strategize, and follow complex orders while possessing strength and speed far beyond normal human limits. The Tyrant Project was born from this vision. Deep beneath the Spencer mansion, in chambers excavated specifically for this purpose, researchers began attempting to create the perfect bioweapon. The project required specific human subjects, individuals whose genetic makeup showed particular markers that researchers believed would allow them to survive the transformation process with cognitive function intact. Finding such subjects was Umbrella's responsibility. Procurement teams operated throughout the region, and the mansion's underground holding cells began to fill. The transformation process was brutal. Subjects were exposed to high concentrations of T-virus under controlled conditions. Their bodies began to change immediately. Muscle mass increased dramatically. Bones thickened and lengthened. The heart grew larger to pump blood through an enhanced cardiovascular system. But most subjects simply died. Their bodies rejected the virus. Tissues broke down faster than they regenerated. Organs failed. Consciousness faded into death while researchers took notes and adjusted parameters for the next attempt. Those who survived the initial transformation often lost their humanity entirely. They became mindless brutes, powerful but uncontrollable. Useful perhaps as shock troops, but failures by the project's standards. The truly successful transformations were rare. When a subject survived with intelligence intact, even diminished, it was considered a breakthrough. These proto-tyrants showed remarkable capabilities. They could open doors, use basic tools, demonstrate problem-solving skills while possessing the strength to tear through steel barriers. But they were also grotesquely mutated. Skin took on a grayish pallor. Flesh seemed to barely contain the musculature beneath. Faces became distorted, eyes glazed with a predatory focus that was distinctly inhuman. The researchers called them T002, T003, designations that marked iteration rather than success. By 1998, the Spencer Mansion had been operating as a research facility for over 20 years. The upper levels showed signs of age. Wallpaper peeling in corners, portraits faded, furniture that seemed frozen in the decade of the mansion's construction. It had the quality of a place suspended in time, neither truly maintained nor completely abandoned. The staff had changed over the years. Original groundskeepers had been replaced. Maintenance personnel came and went, always carefully vetted, always isolated from the research below. But the isolation was taking its toll. Researchers who spent months in the underground facilities began displaying signs of psychological stress, paranoia, hallucinations. Several requested transfers and were refused. Their knowledge of the facility's secrets made them security risks that couldn't be allowed to leave. Some researchers simply disappeared from the records. Whether they had died in accidents, been terminated for security reasons, or suffered fates related to their own experiments remained unclear. The mansion kept its secrets, and the surviving staff learned not to ask about empty quarters. The specimens contained within the facility had grown in number and variety. Entire wings of the underground complex were dedicated to storage, holding cells for failed experiments that were too valuable to destroy. Creatures kept in chemically induced stasis, organisms sealed behind reinforced glass while researchers observed their long-term stability. The Cerberus specimens had multiplied. Dozens of infected dogs patrolled certain sections of the facility, responding to handlers equipped with pheromone emitters. They served as both test subjects and security measures. The insect specimens had proven difficult to fully contain. Wasps built hives in the ventilation systems. Spiders colonized dark corners of unused passages. The researchers had simply accepted their presence in certain areas, marking those sections as contaminated zones and avoiding them when possible. And in the botanical research wing, plant specimens had overtaken entire rooms. Vines thick as cables wound through the infrastructure. Roots had broken through floor tiles. Some plants had developed motility, their tendrils reaching toward anything warm-blooded that entered their territory. Researchers entered these areas in protective suits and harvested samples quickly before retreating. The mansion above and the laboratories below had begun to blur together. Contamination was no longer fully preventable. Sealed doors developed leaks. Air filtration systems that once kept the levels separate now circulated a mixture of outside air and laboratory atmosphere. The facility was becoming its own ecosystem, one designed by humans but no longer fully controlled by them. Part 4. The final weeks before outbreak. In the spring of 1998, several factors converged that would seal the Spencer Mansion's fate. The Tyrant Project had achieved a significant breakthrough. A subject designated T-002 had survived transformation with substantial cognitive function. It could follow complex commands, demonstrated strategic thinking, and possessed physical capabilities that exceeded all projections. Spencer himself visited the facility to observe this success, one of his rare personal appearances at the mountain laboratory. He stood before the containment tube where the Tyrant floated in preservative solution, its massive form suspended in green-tinted fluid. Clawed hands curled against its chest, eyes closed in what might have been sleep or meditation. Spencer was pleased. After decades of work, his vision had produced something that could change warfare, could serve as the foundation for a new era of Umbrella's dominance in the bioweapons market. He authorized expansion of the project. Additional subjects would be procured, transformation procedures would be refined, and within months, Umbrella would have a stable of these creatures ready for field testing. But Spencer's ambitions had also bred resentment. Albert Wesker had been assigned to the facility years earlier, officially as a security liaison. But his true role was more complex. He was a researcher, a coordinator between the mansion and Umbrella's broader operations, and though no one fully realized it, a man with his own agenda. Wesker had grown frustrated with the pace of research, with the limitations imposed by Spencer's cautious approach, with the years spent in isolation serving someone else's vision. He began making his own plans. Through contacts outside Umbrella, Wesker established communication with rival organizations interested in Umbrella's research. He prepared to steal data, to sabotage the facility, and to disappear with enough genetic samples to establish his own operation. But his plans required perfect timing and a significant distraction. In May 1998, one of the researchers in the mansion's viral containment wing made a critical error. During routine maintenance on a storage system, a vial of T-virus was mishandled. The glass cracked, and aerosolized virus particles entered the ventilation system before safety protocols could engage. The contamination spread through the underground levels within hours. Researchers working in connected sections were exposed. Some showed symptoms immediately: fever, disorientation, aggression. Others seemed unaffected initially, but carried the virus in their systems, spreading it further as they moved through the facility. The head researcher initiated lockdown procedures. Sealed sections were isolated. Contaminated areas were flagged for decontamination, and Umbrella's central command was notified of the situation. But the containment had failed too slowly. Within days, researchers who had been exposed began transforming. The T-virus worked through their systems, breaking down cognitive function while enhancing physical durability and aggression. These were not controlled test subjects. These were trained scientists who knew the facility's layout, who had access to security systems, who could open doors and navigate passages even as their humanity eroded. The mansion's staff attempted to evacuate. Security personnel tried to reach the surface levels, but the infected spread faster than anyone anticipated. Within a week, the underground facility had fallen almost entirely to contamination. Those who survived barricaded themselves in secure rooms, sent distress signals to Umbrella headquarters, and waited for rescue that would never arrive. Umbrella's response was coldly calculated. The Spencer mansion had become a liability, a facility whose secrets were too dangerous to let fall into outside hands. If local authorities discovered what had happened, or if the contamination spread beyond the mountain, the entire corporation would be exposed. The decision was made to contain the situation permanently. Umbrella stopped responding to transmissions from the mansion, sealed the facility remotely through electronic locks, and began planning to destroy all evidence. But several factors complicated these plans. The contamination hadn't remained fully contained underground. Some infected had reached the surface, made it into the forest surrounding the mansion, and begun spreading through the wilderness. Local reports in May and June of 1998 began describing strange occurrences in the Arklay Mountains. Hikers who disappeared, campers found dead with unusual injuries, sightings of wild dogs that seemed diseased and unnaturally aggressive. The Raccoon City Police Department received these reports, but initially attributed them to natural wildlife encounters. Bears or wolves. The mountains had always been dangerous for the unprepared, but the incidents increased, and on July 23, 1998, the Raccoon Police Department's Special Tactics and Rescue Service, known as STARS, received orders to investigate. Part 5. Bravo Team's arrival. The decision to send STARS was influenced by factors the team wasn't fully aware of. Umbrella had significant influence within Raccoon City's government and police structure. The corporation employed thousands in the region, funded civic projects, and maintained relationships with key officials who could be persuaded to act in the company's interests. When reports of attacks in the Arklay Mountains threatened to attract state or federal attention, Umbrella wanted local law enforcement to investigate first, to hopefully attribute the incidents to natural causes, or if evidence of Umbrella's activities was discovered, to ensure that evidence could be controlled or destroyed before wider investigations began. STARS was the perfect tool for this purpose. An elite unit with excellent training but limited numbers. A team that could be monitored, influenced, or eliminated if necessary. Albert Wesker, now serving as STARS captain, ensured that the team would be sent into the mountains. He had his own reasons. His plan to steal Umbrella data and disappear required chaos, required the facility to be exposed in a way that would cover his own theft of materials and information. On the evening of July 23rd, Bravo team lifted off from Raccoon City in their helicopter. The team consisted of 6 members. Enrico Marini, the team leader. Rebecca Chambers, the young medic. Richard Aiken, communications specialist. Forrest Spire, the marksman. Kenneth Sullivan, the chemist. And Edward Dewey, the pilot. They carried standard police weapons. Handguns, shotguns, some rifle ammunition. Equipment suitable for search and rescue, but not for what they would actually encounter. The flight into the mountains proceeded normally at first, twilight settling over the forested slopes, the helicopter following valleys northward, searching for signs of the missing hikers or the reported attack sites. But approximately 40 minutes into the flight, the helicopter experienced sudden engine failure. Later investigation would reveal that the failure wasn't mechanical. Something had contaminated the fuel system, something biological that had been introduced deliberately. Wesker's sabotage, ensuring that Bravo team would be forced down in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. Edward Dewey managed to control the descent, bringing the helicopter down in a clearing near an abandoned facility. What the team would later learn was the Umbrella Corporation's training facility, another location tied to the company's research but separate from the mansion itself. The crash landing was rough but survivable. The helicopter damaged beyond flight capability, but the team mostly uninjured. They gathered their equipment, checked for injuries, and began to assess their situation. Night was falling, the forest around them growing dark, and they were miles from any known road or settlement. Enrico made the decision to seek shelter, to find a location where they could establish radio contact with Raccoon City and wait for Alpha Team to locate them. The team began moving through the forest, staying together, weapons ready, aware that whatever had attacked hikers in these mountains might still be present. They had walked perhaps 20 minutes when they encountered the first bodies, 2 people. Hikers, based on their clothing and equipment, dead for perhaps a week based on the state of decomposition. Their injuries were extensive and unusual, large bite marks, flesh torn rather than cut, and signs that they had been partially consumed. Rebecca Chambers examined the bodies, her medical training telling her these weren't normal animal attacks. The bite patterns were wrong. The feeding behavior didn't match any documented predator in the region. The team moved on, more cautious now, and shortly they discovered something worse: the dogs. 3 of them emerged from the underbrush, moving with an unnatural gait, their bodies showing advanced decomposition, patches of exposed muscle and bone, eyes that reflected the team's flashlights with a milky white sheen. These were Cerberus specimens, escaped or released from the mansion during the contamination, now roaming the forest, hunting anything warm-blooded. The creatures attacked immediately. The team opened fire, their weapons effective but requiring multiple hits to drop each animal. The dogs seemed not to feel pain, not to slow from injuries that should have been instantly fatal. Forrest Spire took down 2 with careful rifle shots to the head. Richard Aiken killed the 3rd with his shotgun after it had closed to within feet of the team. In the aftermath, the team regrouped, shaken but unharmed, examining the dead animals with growing unease. Kenneth Sullivan recognized that something was fundamentally wrong with these creatures. They showed signs of disease, but also signs of something else. Some kind of biological agent that kept tissue functioning even as it decayed. Enrico made the decision to continue toward the facility they'd seen from the air, a structure that might offer shelter and communication equipment. They reached the building as full night settled over the mountains. Found it abandoned, doors standing open, papers scattered across floors. Evidence of a rapid evacuation. The team split up to search the facility, looking for working phones, radio equipment, any way to contact Raccoon City. Rebecca Chambers found herself in a laboratory area, examining paperwork that referenced something called the T-virus, reading descriptions of biological weapons research, realizing with growing horror that the facility hadn't been abandoned recently. It had been deliberately shut down, and whatever research had been conducted here was connected to the attacks in the forest. In another part of the building, Kenneth Sullivan discovered similar evidence. Documents describing viral experimentation, transformation protocols, warnings about containment breaches. Before the team could fully regroup and share their findings, they heard sounds from deeper in the facility. Movement in the darkness, footsteps that dragged, breathing that sounded wet and labored. Kenneth Sullivan went to investigate, moving down a corridor toward the sounds, his flashlight cutting through darkness. And then his radio transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by a brief scream and the sounds of struggle. The team converged on his location, found blood on the floor, drag marks leading further into the building, but no sign of Kenneth himself. Enrico made the decision to pursue, to find their teammate. The team moved deeper into the abandoned facility, weapons drawn, staying together now. Aware that something in the building was hunting them, they found Kenneth minutes later, or what remained of him. His body lay in a corridor, torn apart, and crouched over him was something that might have once been human. A creature with grayish skin and clouded eyes, dressed in tattered remnants of a lab coat, its mouth covered in blood. The creature turned toward the team and lunged. They killed it with concentrated fire, but the damage was done. Kenneth was dead, and the team now understood they were facing something unprecedented, something that required new rules of engagement. Enrico attempted to establish radio contact with Raccoon City, managed to send a broken transmission describing their situation, requesting immediate backup. But the signal was weak, and he couldn't be certain the message had gotten through. The team made the decision to abandon the training facility, to move through the forest toward any location that might offer better shelter and communication capabilities. They left Kenneth's body, a decision that weighed on all of them. But bringing it would slow them down, and they needed speed now. Needed to put distance between themselves and whatever else might be in that building. As they moved through the forest in darkness, using flashlights sparingly to preserve batteries, they became separated. The terrain was difficult. Thick underbrush, fallen trees. Visibility limited to a few feet in any direction. Enrico Marini found himself alone, trying to backtrack to locate his team, when he spotted lights in the distance. Not flashlights, but steady illumination. Windows of a structure. He moved toward it. emerging from the forest to find himself standing before an enormous mansion.
The Spencer Estate!
The building rose before him, 3 stories of elaborate architecture, lit windows suggesting occupancy, a gravel driveway leading to heavy wooden doors. Enrico approached cautiously. His radio had failed completely. He was armed but alone, and every instinct told him this place was connected to what had happened to his team. He reached the front doors, found them unlocked, and stepped inside. The entrance hall was impressive, a grand space with marble floors and a double staircase, but something about it felt wrong. Dust covered most surfaces, the portraits on the walls seemed to watch him, and the silence inside was absolute. Enrico moved through the mansion, searching for phones, for people, for any explanation of what was happening. He found evidence instead. Documents scattered in rooms, photographs of research subjects, maps of underground facilities, and slowly he began to piece together the truth. This mansion was owned by Umbrella Corporation. It served as a cover for biological weapons research, and the creatures his team had encountered were the result of containment failures. Enrico knew he needed to reach his team, needed to warn them about what they were facing, but as he moved through the mansion's corridors, he became aware that he was being followed. Something moved in the shadows, stayed just beyond the reach of his flashlight, breathing that echoed from unseen passages. He quickened his pace, trying to find an exit. But the mansion's layout was confusing. Doors led to locked rooms, hallways ended in dead ends, and the presence behind him drew closer. In a gallery hung with paintings, Enrico finally turned to confront whatever was following him, and saw a figure emerge from darkness. A man, tall, wearing dark clothing. Someone Enrico recognized from security photographs at the Raccoon City Police Department. Albert Wesker. Enrico demanded answers, asked what Wesker was doing here, why a member of STARS was inside a facility connected to biological weapons. Wesker smiled and began explaining that Enrico had stumbled into something much larger than a simple rescue mission. That STARS had been sent here deliberately. That they were test subjects for Umbrella's creatures, data points to measure combat effectiveness. Enrico reached for his weapon, but Wesker moved faster than seemed possible, crossing the space between them in an instant. And before Enrico could react, he felt pain blossom in his side. He looked down to see blood spreading across his shirt. Wesker had shot him, the sound of the gunshot echoing through empty halls. Enrico stumbled backward, trying to bring his own weapon to bear, but Wesker had already vanished into the shadows. Wounded and losing blood, Enrico knew he was dying, but he had to try to reach his team, had to try to warn them that their own captain was compromised, was working with Umbrella. He began moving through the mansion, leaving a trail of blood behind him, searching for any of his team members, growing weaker with each step. Meanwhile, Rebecca Chambers had also become separated from the team. She moved through the forest carefully, listening for sounds of her teammates, and heard something else instead. Not footsteps, but a low rumbling, mechanical. Following the sound, she discovered an overturned military transport vehicle, its back doors hanging open. And inside, she found something remarkable. A young man, injured, unconscious, wearing the uniform of an ex-military criminal. She recognized him from briefings. Billy Cohen, a Marine sentenced to death for murders committed during a mission, who had been en route to his execution when this transport had crashed. Rebecca faced a choice. This man was a convicted criminal, but he was also injured and unconscious, and her oath as a medic required her to help. She began treating his wounds, and when he regained consciousness, they established an uneasy alliance. Billy claimed he hadn't committed the murders he'd been convicted of, said he'd been framed for atrocities committed by his commanding officer. Rebecca didn't know whether to believe him, but recognized she needed help surviving in these mountains. Together they moved through the forest, seeking shelter. And like Enrico before them, they spotted the lights of the Spencer mansion. They approached more cautiously than Enrico had, circling the building, looking for signs of danger, and found a side entrance that led into a room filled with medical equipment. Inside, they discovered documentation that confirmed Rebecca's worst fears. The mansion was a research facility. The creatures they'd encountered were deliberately created bioweapons, and Umbrella Corporation had been conducting these experiments for decades. Rebecca realized her team was in danger, that they might have entered this mansion seeking shelter without knowing what waited inside. She needed to find them, needed to warn them. But as she and Billy began exploring the mansion's interior, they encountered the infected, former researchers, security personnel, people who had lived and worked in this facility, now transformed into mindless predators that attacked on sight. Rebecca and Billy fought their way through corridors, using ammunition sparingly, learning to avoid confrontations when possible, and gradually mapping out the mansion's bizarre layout. They discovered rooms filled with puzzles, doors that required specific items to unlock, a grandfather clock that only chimed when particular objects were placed on its face. The mansion had been designed as a security system, layers of complexity that would confound intruders. In the mansion's library, they found a diary. It had been written by one of the researchers, entries spanning weeks, describing the initial outbreak, the panic as containment failed, colleagues transforming one by one, survivors barricading themselves in secure areas, and finally the researcher's own infection, the final entries becoming less coherent, handwriting degrading into scrawls, ending mid-sentence as humanity slipped away. Rebecca felt a chill reading those words, realizing that every creature they'd killed had once been a person, someone with a life and family, someone who had simply been doing their job when biology betrayed them. But sympathy couldn't change what they had become, couldn't make them less dangerous. She and Billy continued deeper into the mansion, finding ammunition and weapons scattered through rooms, medical supplies in bathrooms, evidence that some survivors had held out for days before succumbing. In the mansion's dining hall, they found Forrest Speyer. He was dead, his body slumped against a wall, killed by multiple gunshot wounds and bite marks, his weapon empty beside him. Evidence that he'd fought to the last round before being overwhelmed. Rebecca knelt beside her teammate, taking his remaining ammunition and his radio, hoping it still worked, hoping she could establish contact with someone outside this nightmare. The radio crackled with static, but no voices. Whatever interference affected communications in these mountains was too strong. She and Billy pressed on, finding stairs that led downward, into levels carved from living rock, corridors lit by emergency lighting, and doors marked with biohazard warnings. They had reached the research levels, the laboratories where Umbrella's experiments had been conducted, where the virus had first escaped containment. Here, the evidence of outbreak was even more apparent. Blood on floors, barricaded doors that had been torn apart, and everywhere the shuffling forms of infected researchers. Rebecca realized they needed to find a way to destroy this place, to ensure that whatever had happened here couldn't spread beyond the mountains. But that meant finding the facility's control systems, meant going deeper still. As they descended further into the underground complex, they heard sounds echoing through the corridors. Not the moaning of infected, but something else. Something larger. Something that moved with heavy footsteps that shook dust from the ceiling. They had entered the tyrant's territory. Rebecca and Billy moved carefully through the lower levels, staying quiet, avoiding the main corridors, and found themselves in a massive chamber dominated by a single enormous glass tube. Inside that tube floated something that barely resembled humanity anymore. The creature was massive, easily 8 feet tall, its body covered in pale gray skin stretched tight over grotesque musculature. Arms ending in claws that could have been fingers once, but had elongated into weapons. And its face. The face retained just enough human structure to be deeply unsettling. Eyes closed, expression peaceful despite the horror of its form. This was the T-002, the tyrant that Spencer had been so proud of. Umbrella's greatest achievement in biological weapons development. Rebecca stared at it, medical training warring with revulsion. Understanding on a clinical level what had been done to create this thing while feeling visceral horror at the result. Billy noticed something else. The preservation fluid in the tube was lower than it should have been, and cracks had formed in the glass. Stress fractures spreading like spider webs across the surface. The containment was failing. They needed to leave. Needed to put distance between themselves and this chamber before the tyrant broke free. But as they turned to go, they heard voices echoing from the corridor they'd entered through. Not the moaning of infected, but actual human voices, calling out. Rebecca recognized one of them. Richard Aiken, another member of her team. Still alive. Still searching the mansion. She called back, and moments later, Richard appeared. Wounded, but mobile. He'd been bitten by one of the giant snakes that infested certain sections of the mansion. The venom was spreading through his system, but he'd managed to find antivenom in a medical storage room. Richard had been searching for other survivors, had found evidence that Enrico was somewhere in the mansion, injured, and that Alpha Team had arrived and entered the building as well. The mention of Alpha Team brought both relief and new concern. More STARS members meant better odds of survival, but it also meant more people at risk in this facility. Richard, Rebecca, and Billy made their way back toward the mansion's upper levels, moving through passages that seemed to shift and reconfigure. Doors that had been locked now standing open, corridors that led to different destinations than before. The mansion felt alive, aware of their presence, actively working against their escape. In the mansion's east wing, they encountered something that stopped them completely. A massive serpent, 40 feet long, its body as thick as a tree trunk, scales gleaming in the dim light. A creature that had been a simple garden snake before exposure to the T-virus transformed it into something from prehistoric nightmares. The snake attacked with shocking speed, its body coiling, jaws unhinging to reveal fangs dripping with venom. Richard pushed Rebecca aside, took the strike meant for her, the fangs sinking deep into his shoulder, venom pumping directly into his bloodstream in quantities that no antidote could counter. Billy opened fire, his bullets punching into the snake's body, and Rebecca joined him, their combined fire finally driving the creature back, sending it retreating into the ventilation systems where it had made its nest. But Richard was dying. The venom was too strong, too much. He could feel it spreading through his body, his vision already beginning to blur, breathing becoming difficult. Rebecca tried to help, tried to slow the venom's spread. But Richard knew it was over. He gave Rebecca his radio, told her to find Enrico, to get out of the mansion and warn Raccoon City about what Umbrella had created here. Then he closed his eyes and was gone. Rebecca took his weapon and ammunition. Another fallen teammate. Another person she couldn't save. The weight of it settling on her shoulders alongside everything else. She and Billy continued through the mansion and finally encountered other members of STARS. Part 6. Alpha Team enters the mansion. Alpha Team had arrived at the Arklay Mountains several hours after losing contact with Bravo Team. Their helicopter pilot was Brad Vickers, nervous but competent, flying the same route that Bravo Team had taken, searching for the downed helicopter or any sign of their colleagues. Captain Albert Wesker led the team from the cabin. Alongside him were Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, and their pilot Brad. They spotted Bravo Team's helicopter in the clearing near the training facility, but saw no sign of the team themselves. The helicopter was empty, damaged, abandoned. Wesker ordered the team to land and search the area. Brad set them down. But as Alpha Team disembarked, they encountered the same creatures that had attacked Bravo Team. Cerberus specimens emerging from the forest, moving with that unnatural gait, bodies showing advanced decomposition. The team opened fire, but the dogs were many, at least a dozen, and they attacked with coordinated pack tactics that seemed impossible for creatures in their state. Brad panicked. He was a pilot, not a combat specialist, and seeing his teammates being swarmed by what appeared to be corpses pushed him over the edge. He took off, lifting the helicopter away from the clearing, leaving Alpha Team stranded on the ground. Chris Redfield shouted into his radio, ordering Brad to return. But the pilot was already gone, the helicopter disappearing over the tree line. The team fell back, firing as they retreated, dropping dogs but unable to stem the tide. And then Wesker spotted the same lights that Enrico had seen earlier. The mansion. He ordered the team to run for it, to seek shelter in the building. They sprinted across open ground, dogs snapping at their heels, and burst through the mansion's front doors, slamming them shut behind them and barricading them with furniture. The dogs threw themselves against the doors, claws scraping wood, but the barrier held. In the sudden quiet that followed, Alpha Team assessed their situation. They were trapped in an unknown building, cut off from their transport, searching for a missing team. And something was fundamentally wrong with the creatures outside. Wesker suggested they split up to search the mansion more efficiently, to look for Bravo Team members and for anything that might explain what was happening. Chris and Jill both objected. Standard procedure was to stay together in unknown environments, but Wesker insisted, said they'd cover more ground separately, could use their radios to stay in contact.
He assigned pairs. Chris with Barry, Jill on her own, and Wesker himself would search independently.
What Chris and Jill didn't know was that Wesker wanted them separated, wanted them vulnerable, needed them to encounter Umbrella's creatures under controlled conditions so he could collect data on the bioweapon's effectiveness against trained combat personnel. The team split up, each taking a section of the mansion, moving into darkness with flashlights and drawn weapons. Part 7. Jill's path through the mansion. Jill Valentine was a specialist in lockpicking and trap disarmament, skills that would prove essential in navigating the Spencer Mansion's elaborate security systems. She moved through the West Wing, checking rooms methodically,
searching for survivors or communication equipment, and finding instead a house of horrors.
The first infected person she encountered was in the mansion's dining room. It had been a man once. Still wore the tattered remains of a suit, but its skin had turned grey. Patches of flesh had rotted away to expose bone, and its eyes were clouded white. Seeing nothing but somehow aware of her presence, the creature turned toward her, mouth opening in a rasping moan, and began shuffling forward. Jill called out, warning it to stop. Her training requiring her to identify targets before using lethal force, but the creature didn't respond to commands, didn't react to her voice as anything human would. It kept coming. She fired. A single shot to the head. The creature dropped, but the sound of her gunshot echoed through the mansion, and from other rooms. From hallways and hidden spaces came answering moans. More of them. Dozens, emerging from wherever they'd been waiting, drawn by the noise. Jill ran, moving deeper into the mansion, finding a door and locking it behind her, buying herself moments to breathe and assess. She was in a study. Walls lined with books. A desk covered in papers. And on that desk she found a document that made her blood run cold. It was a research report, dated just weeks earlier, describing the successful transformation of human subjects using something called the T-virus, detailing the creature's capabilities, their weaknesses, their purpose as biological weapons. Jill realized she wasn't in a house. She was in a laboratory. And everything that had happened, the attacks in the mountains, the infected creatures, it was all deliberate. Someone had created these things! She gathered the documents, evidence that would prove what Umbrella had done, and continued searching the mansion. In a small room off the main corridor, she found something that would prove crucial. A broken shotgun mounted on the wall, ornate but clearly functional, and a plaque beneath it suggesting it served as some kind of key or mechanism. Jill had encountered similar security systems in her training. Wealthy estates that used art objects as locks, requiring specific items to be placed in specific locations to open hidden passages. She searched nearby rooms, found a working shotgun in a closet, and returned to the mounted weapon, carefully replacing it with the functional one, keeping the weight balanced. There was a click, and a section of wall slid aside, revealing a corridor that led deeper into the mansion's interior. These hidden passages became a pattern. Everywhere Jill went, she found rooms that required solving puzzles to progress. A piano that would only open a secret door if specific keys were played in sequence. Paintings that had to be arranged in chronological order. A four-faced clock that required placing masks on its surface in positions corresponding to times of day. The mansion was designed to confuse, to delay, to ensure that only someone with specific knowledge could navigate efficiently. But Jill was patient, methodical. She solved each puzzle, collected keys and items hidden throughout the building, and gradually mapped the mansion's layout in her mind. She also found evidence of recent occupation. Coffee cups, still warm in a study. A desk lamp that had been left on. Someone had been in these rooms recently. Someone who might still be alive. In the mansion's greenhouse, a massive conservatory filled with exotic plants, Jill encountered something that challenged everything she thought she understood about botany. The plants were enormous, vines as thick as her arm, flowers that stood 6 feet tall, and some of them moved, not swaying in a breeze, actually moved, tendrils reaching toward her, roots pulling across the floor, demonstrating hunting behavior that no plant should possess. Jill, navigated carefully through this space, avoiding the larger specimens, and found in the center of the conservatory a massive flowering plant that seemed to be the source of the infestation. This was plant 42, designated in research notes she'd found earlier, a specimen that had been exposed to T-virus in the early days of research, that had grown and adapted over years, developing a rudimentary nervous system and predatory instincts. The plant attacked when Jill approached, vines lashing out, attempting to wrap around her limbs, dragging her toward the main body where digestive enzymes pooled in the flower's center. Jill fired at the plant, her bullets tearing through vegetable matter, but seeming to cause only superficial damage. The plant regenerated too quickly, grew new vines to replace those she destroyed. She needed something more effective. In a storage room connected to the greenhouse, she found containers labeled with chemical formulas, herbicides that had been used to control the plant's growth, industrial-strength compounds designed to kill quickly and thoroughly. Jill mixed the chemicals, created a solution that she poured directly into the plant's root system, and watched as plant 42 began to wither. The vines retracted, the flowers drooped, and within minutes, the entire organism had collapsed into a pile of rapidly decomposing vegetation. Jill continued through the mansion, her ammunition running low, her nerves frayed from hours of navigating through darkness and danger. But she was getting closer to understanding the facility's layout. She found stairs leading down into the research levels and made the decision to descend. The lower levels were different from the mansion above, less ornate, more functional. Metal walls and locked doors, fluorescent lighting that flickered and buzzed. The aesthetic of a working laboratory rather than a residence. Here Jill found the evidence she'd been searching for, research notes describing the entire scope of Umbrella's experiments. Virus strains catalogued and stored, transformation protocols detailed with clinical precision, and photographs of test subjects in various stages of mutation. She also found holding cells, rooms where human subjects had been kept before transformation, chains attached to walls, blood on floors, evidence of suffering that made her stomach turn. In one cell, she found a diary similar to the one Rebecca had discovered. This had been written by a researcher who opposed the experiments, who had tried to sabotage the project from within. Entries describing attempts to leak information to authorities, to contaminate virus samples, to free test subjects before they could be transformed. The final entry was dated the day before the outbreak. The researcher writing that they'd been discovered, that security was coming for them, that this would be their last chance to tell the truth. The diary ended there, and Jill had no doubt what had happened to its author. She gathered as much documentation as she could carry, knowing this evidence needed to reach authorities, needed to expose what Umbrella had done. But as she moved deeper into the facility, she encountered something that stopped her completely. A figure in a corridor ahead, moving with purpose rather than the shuffling gait of the infected, wearing dark clothing and moving with military precision. Captain Wesker, Jill called out to him, relief flooding through her at finding another survivor, asking if he'd found any members of Bravo team, if he knew what had happened in this facility. Wesker turned to face her, and something in his expression made Jill's hand move instinctively toward her weapon. He smiled, and began explaining that she'd been brought here deliberately, that STARS had been sent into the mountains as test subjects, that every encounter with Umbrella's creatures had been monitored and recorded, data being collected on combat effectiveness and survival rates. Jill demanded to know what he meant, what his role was in this nightmare. Wesker explained calmly that he'd been working for Umbrella for years, that his position in STARS had been arranged to provide Umbrella with combat-ready test subjects, that everything that had happened was according to plan. Jill raised her weapon, ordered Wesker to surrender. But he moved with inhuman speed, crossing the distance between them faster than her eyes could track, knocking the gun from her hand before she could fire. He explained that he'd been enhanced, given experimental treatments that pushed human capability beyond normal limits, that he was proof of what Umbrella's research could achieve with the right subject. Then he left her there, vanishing into the facility's depths, leaving Jill to recover her weapon and process what she'd learned. Her own captain had betrayed them, had sent them into this facility knowing what waited, had been working for Umbrella all along. Jill continued through the facility, more determined now, needing to find Chris and Barry, needing to expose Wesker's betrayal and escape this place with evidence of what Umbrella had done. Part 8. Chris's Journey and Barry's Dilemma. Chris Redfield had taken the mansion's east wing, moving with Barry Burton, the team's weapons specialist, a man Chris trusted with his life. But Barry was carrying a burden that Chris knew nothing about. Weeks before the mission to the Arklay Mountains, Umbrella operatives had approached Barry. They had photographs of his family, his wife and children, and they had made their position clear. Barry would cooperate with their instructions, or his family would suffer. Wesker had given Barry specific orders to manipulate Chris and Jill, to lead them into dangerous situations, to ensure they encountered the most powerful specimens, all while collecting data for Umbrella's research. Barry was trapped, torn between loyalty to his teammates and terror for his family. Following orders he despised while hoping for some way out. As he and Chris moved through the mansion, Barry found himself subtly directing their path, suggesting they check certain rooms, leading Chris toward areas where infected congregated, following Wesker's instructions even as guilt ate at him. Chris noticed nothing, trusted his teammate completely, relied on Barry's experience and judgment. They discovered a medical bay in the mansion's east wing, a facility that had been used to treat injured researchers, now abandoned, but still stocked with supplies. Chris began gathering first aid equipment, bandages, and antiseptics that they might need, while Barry stood watch at the door. And then Barry saw him, a figure at the end of the hallway, someone he recognized from briefings. Enrico Marini, the Bravo team leader, wounded and leaning against the wall but alive. Barry should have called out to Chris, should have rushed to help Enrico. But Wesker's orders had been explicit. If any Bravo team members were found alive and trying to expose the truth about Umbrella, Barry was to ensure they didn't succeed. Enrico saw Barry, called out to him, tried to warn him about Wesker, about the betrayal, about Umbrella's involvement. Barry raised his weapon, his hands shaking, every instinct screaming at him not to do this, but the image of his children's faces flashing through his mind. He fired. The shot went wide deliberately, impacting the wall beside Enrico, giving the Bravo team leader time to stumble away into the darkness, escaping before Barry could be ordered to fire again. Chris came running at the sound of the shot, demanded to know what happened. Barry lied, said he'd seen one of the infected, had fired but missed. The creature had escaped into the mansion's depths. Chris accepted this, had no reason to doubt, and they continued their search. In a storage room they found ammunition and weapons, evidence that someone had been stockpiling supplies, preparing for extended survival in the mansion. Chris also found a journal Another researcher's diary, this one describing the final days before the outbreak, the growing awareness among staff that containment was failing, the decision by Umbrella's administrators to abandon the facility rather than rescue personnel. The researcher had written about colleagues transforming, about sealing themselves in rooms and waiting for death or transformation, about the complete abandonment by the company they'd served. Chris felt rage building at Umbrella for creating these weapons, at the researchers who'd participated willingly, at the entire system that had allowed this to happen. He and Barry descended to the mansion's basement levels, following a trail of blood that suggested someone injured had come this way recently. They found Enrico in an underground corridor, dying from the wounds Wesker had inflicted earlier, barely conscious but still trying to warn them. Chris rushed to his side, tried to stop the bleeding, but Enrico's injuries were too severe. Too much time had passed. With his final words, Enrico tried to tell Chris about Wesker, about the betrayal, about Umbrella's influence in STARS, but his voice failed before he could explain everything. He died in Chris's arms, another casualty of Umbrella's secrets. Barry stood nearby, guilt written across his face, knowing he'd contributed to this death, knowing his shot could have saved Enrico if he'd aimed true, but still unable to confess because his family's safety depended on his silence. Chris and Barry continued deeper into the facility and entered areas where the outbreak's effects were even more apparent. Entire corridors filled with infected, researchers who had transformed in groups, now shuffling through the passages they'd once walked as humans, mindlessly patrolling the laboratories where they'd conducted experiments. Chris and Barry fought their way through, conserving ammunition when possible, using environmental hazards to thin the numbers, overturning chemical storage to create barriers of toxic fumes, electrifying waterlogged floors to eliminate groups at once. In the lower laboratories, Chris discovered the full scope of Umbrella's research. Specimen tanks containing failed experiments, creatures that represented dead ends in the evolution of biological weapons, organisms too unstable to use but too valuable to destroy, kept in stasis for future study. He saw massive insects pinned behind glass, plants that had developed nervous systems, fish that had grown to impossible sizes, and in one massive tank, something that made him stop completely. A creature that looked like a hybrid of human and shark, created through viral manipulation of both species. Its body covered in grey skin that resembled both flesh and scales, its mouth full of multiple rows of teeth, eyes that reflected his flashlight with an almost intelligent gleam.
This was Neptune, one of Umbrella's attempts to create aquatic bioweapons. Creatures that could operate in underwater environments, that could be deployed to disable naval vessels or attack coastal installations. The tank had cracked during the outbreak, water leaking out, and the creature inside was still alive, still waiting. Chris moved past quickly, not wanting to know what would happen if that tank fully failed. He and Barry found stairs leading even deeper, down to what the signage indicated was the lowest level of the facility, a high-security zone that required special authorization to enter. The doors had been sealed electronically, but power failures during the outbreak had left them unlocked, standing slightly open, an invitation into the deepest of Umbrella's secrets. Chris pushed through, Barry following reluctantly, and they entered the chamber that housed the Tyrant Project. The same chamber that Rebecca and Billy had discovered earlier, though by different access points. The mansion's security systems had been designed with redundant paths, ensuring researchers could reach critical areas even if primary routes were compromised. The containment tube dominated the space, 8 feet of glass holding the T-002 in preservation fluid. And as Chris approached, he realized the cracks that Rebecca had noticed earlier had spread. The glass was failing, stress fractures covering the entire surface. And even as he watched, a chunk of glass fell away, preservation fluid beginning to pour out. Barry grabbed Chris's arm, tried to pull him back, said they needed to leave immediately, but Chris stood transfixed, watching as the fluid level dropped, as the creature inside began to move. Its eyes opened, milky white, but aware, focusing on the men standing before it. The tyrant was waking up. Chris and Barry ran, sprinting back toward the stairs, and behind them they heard the sound of shattering glass, the crash of the containment tube failing completely, and then footsteps, heavy and deliberate, following them. Part 9: Convergence and Revelation. As events unfolded through the mansion, as both teams fought for survival through different sections of the facility, paths began to converge. Rebecca and Billy, having survived their own encounters and gathered evidence about the outbreak's origins, were making their way toward the mansion's main hall, seeking other survivors. Jill, armed with documentation proving Umbrella's crimes and aware of Wesker's betrayal, was fighting through the research levels, trying to reach the surface and warn any surviving team members. Chris and Barry, fleeing from the awakened tyrant, were navigating back through the facility's maze of corridors, seeking escape routes while being pursued by Umbrella's most dangerous creation. They all converged in the mansion's main hall, the grand entrance where this nightmare had begun, meeting in the space beneath the chandelier and the dual staircases. The reunion was brief. Questions rapid fire, each member sharing what they'd learned. Rebecca reported the deaths of Richard, Forrest, and Kenneth, the casualties that Bravo team had suffered. Jill revealed Wesker's betrayal, his admission that STARS had been brought here as test subjects, his role in Umbrella's research. Chris added what Enrico had tried to tell him before dying, confirmation that their own captain had been compromised. And Barry, finally, broke his silence. He confessed everything: Umbrella's threats against his family, the orders he'd received from Wesker, the shots he'd fired that had wounded Enrico, the ways he'd been manipulating the team throughout their time in the mansion. Chris's reaction was immediate: rage and betrayal, his hand moving toward his weapon, but Jill stopped him. Barry had confessed, had chosen his teammates over continued compliance with Umbrella, and they needed everyone capable of fighting if they were going to survive what came next, because the tyrant had found them. The creature emerged from a side corridor, its massive form having to duck through doorways designed for humans, claws scraping against walls, moving with surprising speed for something so large. The team scattered, taking defensive positions throughout the hall, opening fire on the creature with everything they had. Bullets struck the tyrant, tore through its flesh, but the creature barely slowed, its enhanced biology allowing it to fight through injuries that would have killed any normal organism instantly. It focused on Chris, seeming to recognize him as the primary threat, and charged with a speed that seemed impossible for something its size. Chris dove aside, the tyrant's claws tearing through the wooden floor where he'd been standing, gouging deep furrows in the hardwood. Barry provided covering fire, his shotgun punching massive holes in the creature's torso, but still it came, still it fought, relentless and seemingly unstoppable. Jill targeted its eyes, tried to blind it, her shots precise even in the chaos. And finally, one bullet found its mark, the tyrant reeling back, one eye destroyed, ichor streaming down its face. But even half-blind, it was lethal. The creature backhanded Rebecca, sending her flying across the hall. She hit the ground hard, not moving, and Billy rushed to her side, dragging her behind cover while the others maintained fire. The team's ammunition was running low. They'd been fighting through the mansion for hours, conserving when possible, but this battle required everything they had. Chris made a decision. He ordered the others to fall back towards the mansion's exit, to get outside while he kept the tyrant occupied. Someone had to stay and ensure the others escaped. Jill refused, said they'd all get out together or none of them would, but Chris was already moving, drawing the tyrant's attention, leading it away from the group. The chase led through the mansion's corridors, Chris barely staying ahead, the tyrant tearing through walls and doors to follow, reshaping the mansion's interior with pure brute force. They ended up in the mansion's underground hangar, a space Chris hadn't known existed, a massive chamber that had been used to house Umbrella's transport vehicles. And there Chris saw something that changed everything. A rocket launcher mounted on the wall, emergency equipment meant for use against escaped specimens, armed and ready. Chris grabbed it, turned to face the tyrant as it burst through the hangar entrance, and fired. The rocket struck the creature center mass, the explosion filling the chamber, smoke and fire consuming the tyrant's form. When the smoke cleared, the creature lay on the ground, its body burned and broken, but impossibly, still moving, still trying to rise. The tyrant's regenerative capabilities were beyond anything Chris had encountered. It would recover from even this, would continue hunting until someone destroyed it completely or it tore them all apart. Chris approached with a second rocket, loaded it into the launcher, and fired point blank into the tyrant's head. This time, finally, the creature stopped moving. Chris stood over the body, breathing hard, aware that he'd just killed what might have been a person once, someone transformed by Umbrella's virus against their will, turned into a weapon they never asked to become. But there was no time for reflection. Alarms began blaring throughout the facility, emergency systems activating, and a recorded voice echoing through the corridors announced that the mansion's self-destruct sequence had been initiated. Wesker had triggered it remotely, his final act before abandoning the facility, ensuring that all evidence of Umbrella's research would be destroyed, along with anyone still inside. Part 10. Escape and Destruction. The team had minutes, perhaps 10, before the entire facility detonated. They converged on the underground hangar where Chris had fought the tyrant, the space offering a direct exit to the surface through a vehicle tunnel. Rebecca had regained consciousness, hurt but mobile, Billy supporting her as they ran. Barry led the way, his knowledge of building structures helping him identify the fastest route out, trying to make up for his earlier betrayals by ensuring everyone escaped. Jill carried the documentation she'd gathered, evidence that couldn't be lost, proof of what Umbrella had done that the world needed to see. Chris brought up the rear, making sure no one was left behind, the team leader in him refusing to leave without everyone accounted for. The facility was collapsing around them, support structures damaged by the tyrant's rampage, explosive charges hidden throughout the building by Umbrella's designers, all those years ago now detonating in sequence. Corridors filled with fire, ceilings collapsed, the path behind them becoming impassable even as they ran forward. They reached the vehicle tunnel, a long concrete passage leading toward the forest, emergency lighting casting everything in red, and at the end they could see trees, open air, escape. Behind them, a final explosion, larger than all the others, the mansion's central support giving way, the entire structure beginning to collapse inward. The team sprinted, lungs burning, legs pushing past exhaustion, and burst out into the forest just as the tunnel behind them filled with fire and debris. They threw themselves to the ground, covered their heads, and felt the shockwave roll over them. When they looked back, the Spencer mansion was gone. The entire structure had collapsed into the underground levels, floors pancaking down into the laboratories beneath, and then secondary explosions had blown apart what remained, scattering debris across the mountainside. Fire rose from the wreckage, consuming everything, destroying all physical evidence of what Umbrella had created there. The team lay in the grass, catching their breath, processing survival, and slowly began checking each other for injuries. Rebecca had fractured ribs. Billy had burns from an earlier encounter with chemical fires. Barry had been bitten but had managed to avoid infection. Chris was exhausted but largely unharmed. Jill had the documents, but they were smoke-damaged and incomplete. They had survived, but at tremendous cost. Kenneth Sullivan, Richard Aiken, Forrest Spire, Enrico Marini, all dead, half of STARS lost in a single mission. And Wesker escaped, his fate unknown, somewhere out in the world with knowledge of Umbrella's research and his own enhanced abilities. Brad Vickers arrived in the helicopter minutes later, having seen the explosion from the air, finally finding the courage to return and pick up any survivors. The team climbed aboard, Billy choosing to disappear into the forest rather than face military justice. Rebecca letting him go, unable to condemn someone who'd saved her life to execution for crimes she believed he hadn't committed. The helicopter lifted off, carrying the survivors away from the Arklay Mountains, away from the burning wreckage of Spencer's vision. Behind them, the fire continued to burn, consuming wood and stone, reducing decades of research to ash and memory. Part 11. Aftermath and what remained. In the days that followed, the official reports began. Raccoon City Police Department investigated the explosion in the Arklay Mountains, found the remains of a structure, identified it as a private estate, but found no evidence of illegal activity. The fire had been too thorough. Umbrella's self-destruct protocols had worked exactly as designed. Nothing remained that could prove what had happened there. Chris and Jill attempted to report the truth, filed statements describing biological weapons research, Umbrella's experiments, the creatures they'd encountered, but without physical evidence, their claims were dismissed. The damaged documents Jill had recovered were deemed insufficient, the photographs too unclear, the research notes too technical to be understood by officials who had no context for virology or genetic engineering. And Umbrella's influence within Raccoon City was substantial. The corporation employed thousands, funded the police department, maintained relationships with city officials who had no interest in believing that their largest employer was creating biological weapons. The investigation was quietly closed, attributed to a gas explosion at an abandoned property. The deaths of STARS members listed as casualties suffered during a rescue operation in dangerous terrain. Official story, nothing more to see, no conspiracy to uncover. Chris and Jill found themselves sidelined within STARS, their credibility damaged by insisting on a version of events that contradicted official findings. Some of their colleagues believing them, others thinking they'd experienced shared delusions brought on by trauma. Barry Burton resigned from STARS, moved his family out of Raccoon City, couldn't live with the guilt of his actions even though his teammates had forgiven him. Rebecca Chambers remained the youngest member of STARS, haunted by the teammates she'd lost, spending nights reviewing medical texts trying to understand the virus that had transformed people into monsters. The Spencer Mansion became a footnote, a strange incident in the Arklay Mountains, occasionally mentioned in local papers when discussing police operations, but largely forgotten by the public. The forest reclaimed the site quickly, vegetation growing over burned timbers. Roots breaking apart the remaining foundation stones, nature healing the scar that human ambition had carved. Hikers who ventured into that area in later months reported odd findings. Twisted pieces of metal that might have been laboratory equipment, fragments of glass that seemed too thick to be normal windows, strange chemical smells that lingered in certain clearings. But these reports led nowhere. No official investigations, no follow-up. The area was simply marked as dangerous on trail maps, a place where unstable ground and potential contamination made it unsuitable for recreation. Over time, even the survivors began to doubt their own memories. The sheer impossibility of what they'd witnessed warring with their rational minds. Had the creatures really been that large? Had the tyrant truly demonstrated that level of intelligence? Or had fear and darkness transformed ordinary threats into legendary horrors? Only the nightmares reminded them it had been real. Dreams of corridors that shifted, of doors that led nowhere, of eyes watching from darkness. Of that moment when glass shattered and something that had been human stepped free. But the Spencer Mansion's story didn't end with its destruction. The virus had escaped, samples taken by Wesker before the facility's collapse, research data transmitted to Umbrella's central servers before the explosion, and most concerning, infected creatures that had escaped into the forest before containment fully failed. The dogs, the crows that had fed on infected tissue, the smaller organisms that could travel far from the mansion's grounds, all potential vectors for spreading the T-virus beyond the mountains. Umbrella knew this, had teams tracking potential contamination, attempting to locate and eliminate escaped specimens before they could spread the infection to human populations. But they couldn't find everything. Couldn't monitor every stream where an infected creature might have died and contaminated the water. Couldn't track every bird that might have fed on infected flesh and carried traces of the virus in its system. The mountains held secrets now, biological time bombs waiting in the ecosystem, and Umbrella could only watch and hope that natural processes would break down the virus before it found new hosts. In the months after the mansion's destruction, there were isolated incidents. A family camping in the Arklay Mountains fell ill, developed fever and disorientation, but recovered after treatment at Raccoon City Hospital. The attending physician noted unusual symptoms, but attributed them to a novel strain of influenza. A hunter found a deer in the forest, acting strangely, aggressive and seemingly unaware of human presence. He shot it, reported the behavior to wildlife authorities. But by the time officials investigated, the carcass had been consumed by scavengers, and no tissue samples could be recovered. Small things, easily dismissed, part of the natural variation in wilderness behavior. But Chris and Jill heard about these incidents, maintained their own files, documenting every strange occurrence in the Arklay region, building a case that they knew might never be officially acknowledged, but that they needed to preserve for their own sanity. They began investigating Umbrella independently, following paper trails, researching the corporation's history and structure, discovering that the Spencer Mansion had been just one facility among many. Umbrella operated research centers around the world, in Europe, in Antarctica, on remote islands, all conducting similar experiments, all developing biological weapons under the cover of pharmaceutical research. The scope of it was staggering. This wasn't a single rogue facility. This was corporate policy, a deliberate strategy to corner the market on next-generation warfare. Chris and Jill realized that exposing the Spencer Mansion alone wouldn't be enough. Even if they could prove what had happened there, Umbrella would simply condemn it as the action of rogue researchers, distance the corporation from individual facilities' crimes, and continue operations elsewhere. They needed to expose the entire network, needed evidence that connected multiple facilities, needed proof of corporate-level decisions that authorized biological weapons development. That investigation would take months, would eventually lead them to Europe, would consume their lives in ways they couldn't predict as they stood in the ruins of their careers in Raccoon City. But that story belongs to another time. For now, in the summer of 1998, the Spencer Mansion was gone. The structure that Oswell E. Spencer had built to house his ambitions. The laboratories where decades of research had been conducted. The corridors where researchers had walked and worked and eventually died. All of it reduced to rubble and ash. The mansion had stood for nearly 30 years, had witnessed the birth of biological weapons that would eventually threaten the entire world, had been the site of horrors that the human mind struggled to comprehend. And now, it was silent, Part 12. The mansion's legacy. The Spencer Mansion's destruction did not erase its impact on the world. The research conducted there, the experiments performed in those underground laboratories, the data collected from decades of viral manipulation, all of it survived in Umbrella's central archives. The T-virus samples that Wesker had stolen before triggering the self-destruct. Those vials represented years of refinement, generations of viral evolution guided by human intelligence toward ever more effective transformation protocols. Those samples would be sold, traded, studied by other organizations, spawning research programs in a dozen countries, ensuring that the work begun in the Arklay Mountains would continue elsewhere. The researchers who had survived the outbreak, those who had evacuated before containment failed completely, they carried knowledge that made them valuable to Umbrella and to rival corporations. Their expertise in viral vectors and mutation catalysts, ensuring continued employment in similar facilities. Some felt guilt for their work, recognized the horror they'd helped create, but most rationalized their participation, told themselves they'd been advancing science, that the applications of their research weren't their responsibility, that they'd simply been doing their jobs. The test subjects who had been transformed, whose bodies had been destroyed or had become the creatures that hunted the mansion's corridors, they were forgotten, no records of their identities preserved, no families notified of their fates. They simply disappeared into Umbrella's classified files. Statistical data points in research reports. The security personnel who had tried to contain the outbreak, who had died fighting creatures that shouldn't exist. They received no recognition, no memorial services. Umbrella simply erased them from employment records, made it seem they'd never worked for the corporation at all. The mansion itself became a legend in Raccoon City. People who lived in the region began telling stories about the explosion in the mountains, about strange lights seen in the forest before that night, about sounds that echoed through the valleys, howls that didn't match any known animal. Some claimed they'd seen the mansion before it burned, described its elaborate architecture, its unusual placement so deep in the wilderness. But others insisted there had never been any structure in that location, that the explosion had destroyed a natural gas deposit or military bunker. The truth became obscured by contradiction, by unreliable accounts, by the sheer impossibility of the official story matching witnessed reality. And that obscurity served Umbrella's purposes perfectly. A clear narrative could be investigated, could be verified or disproven. But confusion, multiple competing versions of events that created a fog where truth became impossible to establish definitively. The few people who knew the complete truth, the STARS survivors, found themselves isolated by that knowledge, unable to convince others, unable to act effectively, reduced to witnesses of their own trauma with no recourse. But the mansion's greatest legacy wasn't the research that survived, or the legends that grew around its destruction. Its greatest legacy was what it proved about human nature. The Spencer Mansion demonstrated that with enough money, enough influence, enough willingness to compartmentalize and rationalize, it was possible to conduct any experiment, to cross any ethical boundary, to treat human beings as laboratory specimens. The researchers hadn't been monsters. They'd been people, educated and intelligent, who convinced themselves that their work was necessary, that the potential benefits justified the costs, that someone else would do it if they didn't. The security personnel who'd guarded the facility hadn't been evil. They'd been following orders, protecting what they believed was legitimate research, perhaps suspecting the truth, but needing their paychecks enough to not ask questions. The administrators who'd authorized funding, who'd reviewed reports of experiments, who'd known exactly what was happening in those underground laboratories. They hadn't been cackling villains. They'd been corporate executives making strategic decisions about product development, treating biological weapons as just another market opportunity. The mansion proved that ordinary people, given the right circumstances, the right incentives, the right distance from consequences, could participate in horror. And that realization was more frightening than any creature the T-virus could create. Part 13. The Mountain's Memory. In the years after the explosion, after official investigations closed and public attention moved on, the site of the Spencer Mansion slowly transformed. The forest that had surrounded the estate began reclaiming the cleared land, saplings sprouting in the ash-enriched soil, roots working through the rubble of the foundation, vegetation covering the scars that construction and destruction had left. Animals returned to the area, deer using the cleared spaces as feeding grounds, birds nesting in the trees that grew where the mansion's wings had stood, smaller creatures making homes in the spaces between broken stones. The contamination that had spread during the outbreak gradually broke down, the T-virus unable to survive long outside host organisms. Sunlight and natural decomposition destroying the viral particles that had been released into the environment. Within 5 years, casual hikers passing through the area would have seen nothing unusual. Just another clearing in the forest, perhaps noticing some oddly regular stones that suggested previous construction, but finding nothing to indicate the structure's true purpose. But beneath the surface, deeper than vegetation could reach, the lower levels of the facility remained. The explosion had collapsed the upper floors into the laboratories below, had filled passages with debris and sealed chambers that had once been open. But the deepest sections, carved directly from bedrock, those spaces survived, buried under tons of rubble, cut off from air and light. The specimen storage chambers waited in darkness. The power had failed, the preservation systems had stopped functioning, and most of the biological samples had died, tissues breaking down in their containment vessels, experiments ending in silent rot. But some specimens survived. The most resilient organisms, those that could enter dormant states, those whose biology allowed them to function without oxygen or nutrients for extended periods. They endured in the darkness, waiting. The plant specimens whose root systems had been extensive enough to survive the collapse, they continued growing slowly in the buried soil, feeding on the decomposing materials around them, adapting to the new environment. The insect colonies that had established themselves in the ventilation systems before the outbreak. Many were crushed or burned, but some sections of ductwork survived intact, became sealed ecosystems where generations of mutated insects continued breeding. And in the deepest chamber, in what had been the Tyrant Project's main laboratory, something else survived. Not the T-002 that Chris had destroyed. That creature was thoroughly dead, but other specimens, earlier iterations of the project, failed transformations that had been kept in stasis for study. Creatures sealed in reinforced containment that the explosion hadn't breached. They remained frozen, suspended between life and death, their metabolisms slowed to near nothing, awaiting conditions that would never come, awaiting scientists who would never return. The mountain kept these secrets, buried them under soil and stone, hid them beneath new growth and seasonal changes. Occasionally, perhaps once or twice a year, seismic activity would shift the buried rubble, open small gaps in the collapsed sections, allow a breath of outside air to penetrate the sealed levels. And in those moments, some of the dormant specimens would stir slightly, responding to the change in atmosphere, biological imperatives triggering even in creatures that had no real consciousness, attempting to wake from stasis only to fall back into hibernation when the gaps sealed again. The mountain held them, contained them, kept them separate from the world they'd been created to threaten. But containment wasn't permanent. Geology moved in time frames measured in centuries, and what was buried could always be uncovered. Somewhere in Umbrella's archives, in encrypted files protected by multiple security layers, blueprints of the Spencer Mansion's lower levels were preserved. Complete maps showing every chamber, every passage, every sealed specimen storage vault, and those files included GPS coordinates, precise location data that would allow someone to find the site, to excavate carefully, to recover whatever remained in the buried laboratories. Umbrella had deliberately preserved this information, hedged their bets against complete loss of research, ensured that even if the facility was destroyed, the data and specimens could potentially be recovered later. Spencer himself had insisted on this redundancy, his long-term thinking extending decades beyond the mansion's operational life, planning for a future where the site might be safely excavated and its secrets retrieved. That future never came during Spencer's lifetime. The old man was eventually killed by his own protege, his empire crumbling as Umbrella's crimes were finally exposed to the world. But the blueprints remained, in databases that survived the corporation's collapse, information that fell into the hands of successor organizations, groups that inherited or purchased Umbrella's intellectual property. The Spencer Mansion site remained known, remained marked, remained a potential source of valuable biological materials. And so, the mountain waited, and the buried laboratories waited, and the dormant specimens waited. The mansion was gone, but its legacy endured. Part 14. Echoes in Memory. For those who had survived the mansion, who had walked its corridors and fought its creatures, the memories never faded. Chris Redfield would dream of the main hall, the chandelier overhead, the sound of footsteps on marble, and would wake with his heart racing, certain he'd heard something moving in the darkness of his bedroom. In these dreams, the mansion was always slightly different. Rooms in wrong locations, doors that opened onto impossible spaces, the architecture of trauma reshaping itself in his subconscious. He would dream of the tyrant, of firing the rocket launcher, of the moment of impact, but in dreams the creature never stayed down, kept rising, kept coming, unstoppable no matter how many times he killed it. Sometimes he dreamed of Wesker, his former captain, standing in the laboratory, explaining calmly how they'd all been brought there to die. And Chris would try to move, to fight back, but found himself frozen, unable to act while Wesker smiled and walked away. These weren't occasional nightmares. These were regular visitors, companions that followed him from Raccoon City through his later travels. Persistent ghosts that no amount of therapy or time could fully exorcise. Jill Valentine's dreams focused on the puzzles, on locked doors and hidden mechanisms, on the growing panic of being unable to find the right key while something approached from behind. She would dream of the mansion's library, of books that needed to be arranged, but the titles kept changing, the languages shifting, the solution always just beyond her grasp while time ran out. She dreamed of the greenhouse, of Plant 42's vines reaching for her, wrapping around her legs, dragging her toward digestive enzymes while she struggled to remember which chemical would kill it. The answer lost in the fog of dream logic. And she dreamed of the documents she'd found, the evidence that would have exposed Umbrella, but when she tried to read them, the text was blurred. Unreadable, the proof she needed dissolving like smoke in her hands. Her nightmares reflected a different trauma than Chris's. Not the fight for survival, but the frustration of knowing the truth and being unable to make others believe, of having the answer but lacking the means to prove it. Rebecca Chambers' dreams were populated by the teammates she'd lost. She would dream of finding Richard in the mansion's east wing, of treating his wounds, but no matter what she did, no matter which antidote she administered, she couldn't save him. Watched him die again and again while her medical training proved worthless. She dreamed of Kenneth, of reaching him before the zombie did, of pulling him to safety, but the corridors kept extending, stretching impossibly long, and she could never run fast enough, always arriving seconds too late. She dreamed of Forrest, finding him in the dining hall, and in dreams he would be alive, would speak to her, would ask why she hadn't saved him, why she'd survived when he hadn't, and she would have no answer. Her nightmares carried guilt, survivor's remorse that logic couldn't dispel, the irrational belief that if she'd been faster, smarter, better, she could have prevented their deaths. Barry Burton's dreams were darker still. He dreamed of the moment he'd fired at Enrico, but in dreams, his aim was true, the bullet finding its target, and he would watch Enrico fall while Wesker stood behind him, hand on his shoulder, whispering that he'd done the right thing, that his family was safe because he'd obeyed. He dreamed of his wife and daughters being held by Umbrella operatives, threatened, harmed, while he stood paralyzed, unable to protect them despite being armed, despite all his training. He dreamed of confessing to the team, of Chris and Jill turning away from him in disgust, of being left alone in the mansion, abandoned by those he'd betrayed, hunted by the creatures his cowardice had helped Umbrella create. Barry's nightmares were about moral failure, about the moment when he'd chosen family over duty, about the knowledge that he'd contributed to his teammates' deaths, even if he'd ultimately tried to make amends. These dreams, these persistent psychological scars, bound the survivors together. They understood each other in ways that other people couldn't, shared an experience that defied normal explanation, carried burdens that couldn't be set down no matter how far they traveled from the Arklay Mountains. In quiet moments, when they gathered to compare notes on Umbrella's operations, when they planned their next moves in the investigation that consumed their lives, they sometimes talked about the dreams, not in detail, not dwelling on the specifics, but acknowledging that the mansion haunted them all, that they carried it with them wherever they went, that some part of them was still walking those corridors, still solving those puzzles, still fighting creatures that shouldn't exist. The mansion had been destroyed, but it lived on in their minds, a ghost structure more permanent than stone, more enduring than any physical architecture. Part 15. The Wider World's Ignorance. While the STARS survivors struggled with their memories and their failed attempts to expose Umbrella, the rest of the world moved on, completely unaware of how close they'd come to biological catastrophe. In Raccoon City, life continued normally. Umbrella Corporation remained the city's largest employer, thousands of people working in pharmaceutical development, manufacturing, administration, logistics, all the legitimate business operations that funded the illegal research. These employees weren't conspirators. They were ordinary people with mortgages and families, working regular jobs, producing actual medications that helped actual patients, contributing to the company's public-facing mission. They had no idea that the profits from their work funded biological weapons development, that their employer maintained hidden laboratories where ethics were abandoned, that the corporate leadership they served was preparing for a future built on weaponized viruses. The compartmentalization was complete. Research divisions were isolated from manufacturing. Security clearances prevented information sharing, and Umbrella's legitimate operations provided perfect cover for activities that would have horrified the public. In Raccoon City's downtown, the Umbrella office building stood as a symbol of civic pride, a gleaming tower that represented economic prosperity, corporate citizenship, the kind of business presence that cities competed to attract. Local politicians praised Umbrella at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, at charity fundraisers, at economic development conferences. They accepted campaign contributions, approved zoning variances, provided tax incentives, all standard practice for maintaining relationships with major employers. None of them knew about the Spencer Mansion, about the outbreak in the Arklay Mountains, about the biological weapons research being conducted with their city's infrastructure as support. The police department continued working with Umbrella on community safety programs. The company donated equipment, funded training initiatives, built relationships that ensured cooperation and loyalty from law enforcement. When STARS members tried to report what had happened in the mountains, those reports were filtered through a system that had been cultivated to protect Umbrella's interests. Dismissed by officials who had every incentive to maintain good relations with the corporation. The universities in the region accepted Umbrella's research grants, their biology and chemistry departments working on projects that seemed benign, studying cellular processes, viral structures, genetic markers, not realizing their work fed into weapons development. Graduate students wrote theses on topics suggested by Umbrella advisors, published papers in journals that Umbrella executives read with interest, contributed to the knowledge base that informed bioweapons research, all while believing they were advancing pure science. The hospitals used Umbrella's drugs, prescribed their treatments, trusted their quality control because the medications worked, actually helped patients, actually saved lives. The legitimate research was real and effective. This created cognitive dissonance for anyone who tried to expose Umbrella's crimes. How could a company that produced life-saving medications also be creating biological weapons? How could a trusted community partner be conducting unethical experiments? The two images didn't reconcile in most people's minds. The news media in Raccoon City, dependent on advertising revenue from Umbrella and other corporations, had no incentive to investigate seriously. A few reporters asked questions about the explosion in the mountains, but when official sources provided explanations, when Umbrella's public relations department released statements, the stories were published and forgotten. Conspiracy theories existed. Of course they did. Every major corporation attracts speculation about hidden activities. But these theories were lumped together with claims about aliens and government mind control, dismissed as the ramblings of paranoid individuals. The truth was hidden not through elaborate cover-up, but through the mundane mechanics of corporate influence, political relationships, economic dependencies, and the human tendency to accept comfortable explanations over disturbing ones. The world looked at Umbrella and saw a pharmaceutical company, successful and innovative, a corporate citizen contributing to medical advancement and economic growth. Only a handful of people knew the truth, and their voices were lost in the noise of normal life, drowned out by the comfortable narratives that allowed society to function without confronting uncomfortable realities. The Spencer Mansion's destruction hadn't exposed Umbrella. It had eliminated evidence, sealed away the truth beneath rubble and ash, and allowed the corporation to continue its work elsewhere while the world remained ignorant. Part 16. The inevitability of Raccoon City. In the months following the mansion incident, Umbrella made decisions that would doom Raccoon City. The corporation needed a new primary research facility, somewhere to continue the work that had been conducted in the Arklay Mountains, somewhere with infrastructure and security, somewhere that could be monitored closely. They chose to expand their underground laboratory beneath Raccoon City itself, a facility that had existed for years as a secondary research site, now promoted to primary status. The decision was logical from Umbrella's perspective. The city offered urban camouflage. The laboratory could be hidden beneath legitimate facilities, and the corporation's influence in the region would help contain any potential problems. But this decision placed millions of viral samples, thousands of experimental subjects, and decades of bioweapons research directly beneath a city of 100,000 people. The risk calculation was simple. Umbrella believed their containment protocols were sufficient, believed that the outbreak at Spencer Mansion had been an anomaly, believed they'd learned from that failure and wouldn't repeat it. They were wrong. The researchers transferred from other facilities brought with them the same mindsets that had led to the mansion's outbreak, the same willingness to cut corners in pursuit of results, the same confidence that they could control forces they barely understood. The security personnel assigned to the underground facility were competent, but they were protecting against external threats, industrial espionage, rival corporations. They weren't prepared for the possibility that the threat might come from inside, from the specimens themselves. The facility's design included multiple redundant containment systems, electronic locks, biological barriers, emergency protocols, but every system is only as reliable as its maintenance, and budget pressures led to delayed repairs, deferred upgrades, accepted risks. In July 1998, just weeks after the Spencer Mansion's destruction, the Raccoon City Laboratory received new specimens, failed experiments from other facilities, creatures too valuable to destroy, but too dangerous to keep at active research sites. These specimens were placed in long-term storage, sealed in stasis chambers, monitored by automated systems. One of those systems malfunctioned. A simple failure, a temperature control unit that should have been replaced during the previous maintenance cycle, but had been marked as acceptable to save costs. It stopped maintaining proper temperature in a storage vault. The specimens inside began to thaw, slowly, their metabolic processes resuming, biological imperatives triggering, and the restraint systems that had been designed for dormant subjects proved insufficient for active ones. A containment breach occurred, small initially, confined to a single vault, but the released specimens were viral vectors. They contaminated the vault's atmosphere, spread infection to other stored organisms, and within hours the breach had expanded to multiple vaults. The security team responded, attempted to re-establish containment, but they were following protocols designed for human intruders, not for dealing with creatures that could squeeze through ventilation ducts or that released airborne viral particles. The breach expanded, spread through the underground facility, reached sections where researchers worked, and the infection found new hosts. By the time Umbrella's administrators understood the scope of the problem, containment had already failed. The infection was loose in the laboratory, and researchers were transforming, becoming vectors themselves, spreading the virus further. Umbrella faced a decision: evacuate the city, admit what had happened, expose their illegal research and face international prosecution, or attempt to contain the outbreak secretly. Hope that their response teams could eliminate the infection before it reached the surface. They chose the latter. Response teams were deployed, special forces units trained specifically for dealing with bioweapon incidents. They entered the underground facility in full contamination gear, carrying flamethrowers and experimental weapons, prepared to sterilize the entire complex. but they were too late. The infection had already reached the city's sewer system. Rats had been exposed, carried the virus through tunnels that connected to every part of Raccoon City, emerged in basements and parking garages, spread contamination throughout the urban infrastructure. And still, Umbrella didn't evacuate, didn't warn the population, because admitting the problem meant admitting their research, meant prosecution, meant the end of the corporation. They believed they could contain it, believed their response teams could hunt down every infected creature, believed they could sterilize the sewers and prevent surface transmission. They were wrong about that too. The infection reached Raccoon City's human population in September 1998. 2 months after the Spencer Mansion's destruction, patients began arriving at hospitals with unusual symptoms: fever, aggression, deteriorating cognitive function. Doctors initially diagnosed various conditions: flu, rabies, encephalitis. They treated symptoms and sent patients home, not realizing those patients were contagious, not knowing they were spreading a weaponized virus through the community. By the time medical authorities recognized they were facing an outbreak of an unknown pathogen, by the time they contacted the CDC and state health departments, by the time evacuation procedures were being discussed, it was too late. The virus spread exponentially. Patients transformed, attacked others, created new vectors. The infection curve steepened beyond any hope of medical containment. Raccoon City was doomed, and the Spencer Mansion, that isolated facility in the mountains where STARS had fought for survival, where the outbreak had been contained through destruction, it had served as a preview. The real catastrophe was always coming to Raccoon City. The mansion had just been the warning that no one heeded. Part 17. The Final Sleep of Memory. And so we return to the mountains, to the site where the Spencer Mansion once stood, to the place where this story began all those years ago when Oswell E. Spencer first envisioned his monument to ambition. The forest is quiet here, has been quiet for years now. The sounds are natural ones: wind through trees, birds calling, the distant rush of streams swollen with mountain runoff. Hikers sometimes pass through, following trails that wind through the Arklay Range. They walk across ground where the mansion's foundation lies buried, rest in clearings where laboratories once operated, drink from streams that flow through soil that once held so much contamination. They know nothing of what happened here. The legends have faded, the stories have been forgotten or dismissed, and the physical evidence has been reclaimed by time and nature. Sometimes these hikers notice things: oddly regular stones that suggest previous construction, fragments of metal that seem manufactured rather than natural, places where vegetation grows in unusual patterns. But these observations lead nowhere, prompt no investigations. They're just curious anomalies in the wilderness, the kind of things that make for brief speculation before being forgotten. The mansion is gone, truly gone. No physical structure remains above ground. No obvious signs mark where it stood. But beneath the surface, in darkness and silence, the lowest levels still exist, buried and sealed, holding specimens that wait in stasis, preserving the legacy of research that the world believes was destroyed. Those chambers will remain sealed, probably. The rubble that covers them is stable. The odds of accidental discovery are minimal, and the organizations that have the knowledge to excavate deliberately have other priorities now, other research avenues, other sources of biological samples. The Spencer Mansion has become a footnote, a historical curiosity in Umbrella's documented crimes, mentioned in reports but not studied in detail, overshadowed by what happened in Raccoon City and at other facilities. For the survivors, for those who walked its corridors and lived to tell, the mansion remains more present, more real, than any current structure they inhabit. Chris Redfield, now hunting bioterrorists around the world, still sometimes finds himself in buildings that remind him of the mansion. A corridor with similar proportions, a room with that particular quality of light. And for a moment, he's back there, hearing the shuffle of approaching footsteps, reaching for weapons that aren't at his side anymore. Jill Valentine, scarred by experiences that followed the mansion, operations that took her across continents, still dreams of locked doors, still feels that particular frustration of having the answer, but not the proof, still carries documents in her mind that the world refused to read. Rebecca Chambers, having left STARS to pursue other paths, to build a life away from combat, still carries the weight of teammates lost, still sees Richard's face when she closes her eyes, still wonders if there was something she could have done differently. Barry Burton, living quietly with his family in a place far from Raccoon City, still wakes some nights in cold sweat, still remembers the moment he chose to fire, still carries the guilt of that decision even though his teammates forgave him years ago. The mansion shaped them, defined them in ways they didn't choose, gave them purpose and took away peace, left them with knowledge they couldn't unlearn and memories they couldn't escape. And perhaps that's the Spencer Mansion's true legacy. Not the research conducted there, not the specimens created in its laboratories, not the virus that escaped its containment. Its true legacy lives in the minds of those who survived, in the dreams that won't fade, in the determination to prevent anything like it from happening again, in the choice to fight rather than forget. The mansion is gone, but its survivors remain, and they remember. They remember every corridor, every puzzle, every creature, every teammate lost. They remember the moment they understood what Umbrella had created, the horror of that realization, the knowledge that humanity could engineer its own extinction and call it progress. They remember the escape, the fire and destruction, the helicopter lifting away while flames consumed everything below, and they remember the silence that followed. The return to a world that didn't believe them. The isolation of carrying truth that others dismissed as trauma or fabrication. The Spencer Mansion taught them what people are capable of, both the horrors they can create and the strength they can summon in response. It showed them that monsters are real, that they're made in laboratories by people in white coats, that they're created deliberately with full knowledge of the consequences, that evil isn't always obvious, but sometimes wears the mask of science and progress. But it also showed them their own resilience, their ability to survive the impossible, to keep fighting when every rational calculation says to give up, to protect each other, even when doing so risks everything. The mansion is destroyed, its physical form erased from the earth, but it lives on. In memories, in nightmares, in the determination of those who survived to ensure that nothing like it happens again. The forest in the Arklay Mountains is peaceful now, quiet, seemingly innocent, just another stretch of wilderness in a world full of wild places. But those who know, those who were there, they understand what lies beneath, what secrets the mountain keeps, what ghosts walk corridors that exist only in memory. The Spencer Mansion's story is over. Its final chapter written in fire and collapse. Its ending as complete as any ending can be. And yet, in another sense, its story never ends. Because those who carry its memory carry it forward into tomorrow and the day after, into years that stretch beyond sight, into a future that must remember the past or risk repeating it. So we let the story rest here, in the quiet of the mountains, in the peace of the forest, in the gentle darkness that falls over all things eventually. The mansion is gone. The fires are cold. The survivors have moved on to other battles. And the mountain remembers, and the darkness remembers, and the forest slowly reclaims what humanity briefly disturbed. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift. Let the story settle into memory like dust settling after a disturbance. The Spencer Mansion stands no more, exists now only in the space between waking and sleeping, in the realm where memory and dream intertwine, in the quiet places where the mind processes trauma and finds meaning. Rest now, as the forest rests, as the mountain rests, as even the buried laboratories rest in their sealed darkness beneath tons of stone and soil. The story is told, the history preserved, the legacy understood. And in the telling, in the remembering, in the acknowledgement of what happened in that place, there is a kind of peace, not forgiveness, not forgetting, but acceptance that some events can't be changed, only witnessed, only remembered, only carried forward as lessons learned. The Spencer Mansion was built in ambition, operated in secrecy, destroyed in fire, and lives on in memory. Its story is complete, its ending written, its place in history secure. And now, in the quiet that follows story's end, in the space where words fade and sleep approaches, we can let it rest. Let the mansion rest in its forest grave. Let the survivors rest in their hard-won peace. Let the memories rest in the minds that hold them. And let yourself rest too, carried by this story into the gentle darkness of sleep, where even the Spencer Mansion's ghosts grow quiet, where even the horrors of the past soften into distant dreams, where peace comes at last to all things. Rest well, sleep deeply, and know that the mansion's story is finished, its secrets told, its darkness explored and understood. Tomorrow brings new stories, new challenges, new battles. But tonight, in this moment, there is only peace, only quiet, only the gentle drift towards sleep. The Spencer Mansion is gone, and so we too can let go, can release the tension, can sink into rest. Good night, sleep well, and thank you for walking through this history with me, for bearing witness to events that should never have happened, for remembering those who survived and those who didn't. The story is told, the night is quiet, and sleep is waiting. Rest now, in peace, in safety, in the knowledge that some horrors exist only in the past, only in memory, only in stories told to keep them from being forgotten. The Spencer Mansion's tale is done, and so we close our eyes and drift into gentle darkness and sleep. Closing. If you enjoyed this journey through the history of the Spencer Mansion, if you found value in this detailed exploration of Resident Evil's origins, please consider subscribing to the channel for more lore-focused sleep stories from the worlds of gaming. Like this video if it helped you relax, if it gave you new appreciation for the story's complexity, or if you simply enjoyed the slow, detailed walk through these events. And sleep well, knowing that unlike the survivors of the Spencer Mansion, your rest tonight will be peaceful, undisturbed by the horrors that exist only in fiction, only in the stories we tell, only in the games we play. Good night, and thank you for listening.